"Come you back, you British soldier, come you back to Mandalay," said Kipling. Well, the British soldier was back in Mandalay. This was March 1945, and a lot was happening. 2 days after our 40th Army recaptured Mandalay, we heard that the Second Army had crossed the Rhine. Victory was in sight at last. You could feel it in the air, here in Burma, as well as in Europe. It was obvious that Germany was on her last legs, ground down between the Russians on one side and General Eisenhower's armies on the other. We knew that Japan was beaten too, though we also knew there was some hard fighting to be done before she would admit it.
The double victory of Mektila-Mandalay in March 1945 marked the climax of the fighting in Burma. The Japanese Burma army never recovered from this blow. The whole of Southeast Asia Command, from the Supreme Commander downwards, above all the 14th Army, commanded by General Slim, felt a sense of exhilaration. Rangoon, the capital of Burma, was still over 300 miles away, yet felt as though it lay just behind the next hill. The advance to Rangoon would be a race with time, to get there before the 1945 monsoon turned the dusty roads of central Burma into quagmires again. All through April, the 14th Army pressed forward, knowing the need for speed. The month of May came in with peals of victory. On the 1st, the German armies in Italy surrendered to Field Marshal Alexander. On the 2nd, the Russians entered Berlin. Adolf Hitler lay dead in the dismal bunker which was all that remained of his Reich. On May the 7th, Germany submitted in unconditional surrender to General Eisenhower. May the 8th, 1945, VE Day. After 5.5 weary years of war, victory in Europe had been won.
This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom is every day. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their bit. Everyone has tried, none has flinched. Neither the long years, nor the dangers, nor the fierce attacks of the enemy have in any way weakened the unbending resolve of the British nation.
Victory in Europe was wonderful news for every one of us, a marvelous tonic. Mussolini and Hitler were dead, two of the most sinister figures who've ever threatened European civilization. But our war was not yet over. We still had to defeat Imperial Japan. The 14th Army was nearing Rangoon, but the monsoon was also approaching, and it was a toss-up which would win. But we had another card up our sleeves, a long-prepared double assault by sea and air. As our main forces closed in up the Rangoon River, we wondered what was going to happen. The Japanese generally defended places to the last man. If they did that now, it would mean fighting our way through the streets, a very grim business. On May the 4th, our forces landed just outside Rangoon and advanced on the city. For once, we couldn't complain if our own successes were somewhat overlooked. It was really bad management to capture Rangoon in the middle of a week so crowded with vast events. But the monsoon was upon us now, and we had to act fast. The first entry here into Rangoon was by amphibious forces, a major combined operation in SEAC at last. The prisoners of war in Rangoon jail had written on the roof, "Japs gone, ex digitate." But in spite of this obviously RAF-inspired exhortation to take our finger out, we hardly dared to hope it was really true. So we carried on with the full-dress landing. Yet it was true, much to everybody's relief. And Rangoon was reoccupied by us without having to be bombed or fought over. This may have been part of the reason for the tremendous reception we got from the Burmese population.
Rangoon was a milepost in the march to victory. The Japanese were completely defeated in Burma. Only remnants fought on, trying to make their escape through the encircling British forces. Yet in May 1945, it appeared that there was still heavy work ahead. In the SEAC area, Malaya, Singapore, Siam, and Sumatra all remained in Japanese occupation. They also occupied the rest of the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and Indochina. At SEAC headquarters, new plans were prepared for new advances.
We did find time for one celebration. On June the 14th, we held our 14th Army Victory Parade in Rangoon, followed by a naval review. The monsoon was well upon us by now, but I don't think the men minded. In fact, they rather relished the rain. Here they said to themselves, "We fought through the bloody rain, it's only right that the bull should take place in the bloody rain." Anyway, they put on a splendid show, but they were splendid troops. These men had marched and fought for 1,000 miles across some of the worst terrain in the world. They'd beaten the Japanese hands down. They'd overcome the monsoon, they'd overcome malaria, their morale was superb. And of course, it was a comfort for them to know that the end of the war in Europe meant that their families were safe at last from bombs and V-2 rockets. Victory in Europe seemed to promise strong reinforcements at last. Landing craft, shipping, aircraft, all the things that were needed to finish off the war. We were already planning a big amphibious operation, Zipper, to capture Malaya and Singapore. But once again, all our hopes were dashed. To my amazement, the Secretary of State for War announced an accelerated scheme of demobilization without even consulting us in SEAC, as though our war was over too. The promises of early repatriation made to the men made an absolute nonsense of our plans. And when you make promises to soldiers and break them, this does more harm to morale than anything. So once more, SEAC had to water down its plans. But with the unpleasant irony that this time we were a case of poverty amidst plenty. Still, we had to get on with it. And I had another serious matter to deal with at the same time. A preview of things to come, as it turned out.
In State House Rangoon, pre-war seat of British government, Mountbatten now grappled with the problems of post-war government. For him, the beginning of an entirely new phase of experience.
In April 1945, I was appointed Chief Civil Affairs Officer, Burma. I went from England to Kandy and met Supremo, and whilst there, he put me in the picture as to what was happening in Burma, and also his policy to be adopted as the British military administration took over. Now, at that time, there was an evacuee civil government in Simla, headed by Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, and in Burma, there was a provisional government that had been set up by the Japanese on the 1st of August 1943.
Burmese nationalism now emerged as a force to reckon with. As well as the puppet provisional government, the Japanese had raised and trained the Burma National Army to fight against British imperialism. The commander-in-chief of this army was Major General Aung San, who now became a key personality. By March 1945, Aung San had realized that Burma's real enemy was not British, but Japanese imperialism. On March the 28th, a week after the capture of Mandalay, the Burma National Army turned against the Japanese. For Mountbatten, this act posed a deeply significant question.
I knew perfectly well that the Burma National Army had supported the Japanese. I also knew that some of them had committed some atrocities at that time. But I knew, too, that they were the only people here in Burma with any popular backing in 1945. The Burmese could either help us, as they were doing by rising against the Japanese, or they could hinder us. And if they did hinder us, my military advice was that it would take 2 divisions to hold them down. I considered the whole idea to be unthinkable. We'd come back here into Burma as rescuers. At that time, we had the goodwill of most Burmese. I certainly didn't want to throw that away. The Burmese showed signs of trusting us, and General Slim, who had met Aung San in May, told me we could trust him. So in June, I issued a directive which said, "The guiding principle which I am determined shall be observed is that no person shall suffer on account of political opinions honestly held, whether now or in the past, even if these may have been anti-British, but only on account of proven crimes against the criminal law or actions repugnant to humanity. This principle is no more than an elementary point of British justice."
When I got into northern Burma, I soon discovered that my senior civil affairs officers were not agreeing to Mountbatten's policy. I discovered, for instance, that after Slim's meeting with General Aung San, that they recommended that Aung San should be arrested, together with some other senior officers of his force, which to my mind was completely wrong, and of course Supremo didn't accept it.
Lord Mountbatten's determination that the British should not return in a punitive spirit was warmly reflected by all us British troops, ordinary people from at home. Even Aung San, who I knew well, always talked about the new British at a particular period then, and Lord Mountbatten himself was affectionately known among the Burmese masses as Prince Mountbatten, after some legendary Burmese hero. But the trouble was that things were always going sour as civil affairs officers returned from Simla, where they'd spent the war in India. And the final straw came when a civil affairs officer actually had General Aung San up on the mat and grilled him about his wartime record. Now, this was altogether too much, and on his next visit to Rangoon, Lord Mountbatten called a meeting of all the senior civil affairs officers in Government House and administered the most tremendous rocket and, in fact, threatened the next offender against his liberal principles with court-martial.
I was shocked and alarmed when only a few months later Aung San and his people came and told me they would prefer to have civil government back, here in State House, Rangoon, instead of my military administration. I was afraid they didn't understand the implications of what they were asking for. And as a matter of fact, Aung San admitted as much, to me and to Sir Hubert Rance later on.
I had set up several committees to deal with the administration of Burma, and to each of these committees I had allotted a Burmese politician. So these Burmese politicians had tasted some of the sweets of executive power, but in fact they were purely advisory and unpaid. So from their point of view, it was essential that the civil government should get back quickly.
But since they'd asked for it, I felt I had to give way. And so I allowed the pre-war civil government to come back and take over from me in October 1945. I now think this was a mistake, because I knew this civil government didn't share my views. I should have tried harder to convince the Burmese, or at least to have delayed matters. And then, according to my Burmese friends, there would have been a good chance of Burma remaining inside the Commonwealth. But what's done is done.
the war against Japan came to its crescendo. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur's forces made their promised return to the Philippines. The general waded back ashore through the surf, a symbolic gesture to wash away the black memories of surrender in 1942. In February 1945, the Americans re-entered Manila. Later that month, they attacked the island of Iwo Jima. The attack went in under cover of a bombardment of 6,800 tons of bombs from the air and 22,000 shells from the great naval guns. Even so, the capture of Iwo Jima cost the Americans a third of their landing force. Out of 20,000 Japanese, only 216 survived as prisoners. This was the grim pattern of the Pacific War. In April 1945, America and her allies suffered a grievous loss. The president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his fourth term of office, died, with the victories which he had done so much to bring about in sight at last.
It had been a great thrill to me to meet Roosevelt at various times during the war. I had admired him ever since he was first elected president. I was a strong supporter of his New Deal policy. The support and help he gave us when we stood alone before Russia or America came into the war were things we could never forget. We became personal friends in 1942 when I stayed with him at the White House. But as Supreme Allied Commander, I stood in a special relationship to him. He made that quite clear to me at Quebec when I was appointed. General Eisenhower, he told me, is as much a servant of your king as of me. I trust you will feel the same way about me in Southeast Asia. I promised him I would be a good American, and he laughed and thanked me. I'd done my best to keep this promise, and he in turn had given me splendid backing, even when I'd been forced to disregard his directives. I felt I'd lost a good friend and an understanding chief.
Already, General MacArthur's forces were committed to the next stage of their advance towards the home islands of Japan. Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The assault on Okinawa went in on April the 1st, another mighty display of amphibious power. The Japanese were now driven to methods of desperation. These were the days of the kamikaze. The name means the divine wind. The typhoon, which destroyed the fleet of Kublai Khan attacking Japan in 1281 AD. In 1945, kamikaze meant suicide attacks by young Japanese pilots devoted to the emperor and contemptuous of death, who tried to crash their planes with full bomb loads on the decks of American and British ships. In the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese flew 1,900 suicide sorties. They sank 26 ships and damaged 164. cities of Japan were being rocked to their foundations by the attacks of American aircraft. B-29s, the super fortresses. The Allies were closing for the kill.
As long as SEAC had been mainly concerned with fighting all the way down from the top end of Burma, there wasn't much opportunity or indeed need for close cooperation with General MacArthur. But now that we were here in Rangoon and all set to make a jump in to Malaya and Singapore, we could obviously help each other more. So I decided to go and see MacArthur at his headquarters in Manila. I was keen to do this anyway because he was such an outstanding figure and I wanted to get to know him. I wasn't disappointed. He was a terrific man. He had a splendid background, he'd won tremendous prestige, and he just oozed personality. His methods were quite unlike mine. He was absolutely autocratic. He never really consulted his army, air, or fleet commanders. He made up his own mind and told them what to do. But although he was 20 years older than me, we got on well together. We had no trouble in agreeing about future plans. Neither of us knew at that stage that all our ideas were soon going to have to be very drastically revised.
On July the 17th, 1945, a week after Mountbatten's meeting with General MacArthur, took place the last of the great inter-Allied conferences of the war, Potsdam. On the day before the conference, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Winston Churchill, toured the ruins of nearby Berlin and was cheered by some of the unfortunate citizens whose defeat was so much his doing. My hate, he wrote, had died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their demonstrations, and also by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes. Also at Potsdam was America's new president, Mr. Harry S. Truman. I was impressed, said Churchill, with his gay, precise, sparkling manner and obvious power of decision. Churchill summoned Mountbatten, who was on his way to England for other consultations, to attend the Potsdam Conference.
I was only present at Potsdam for a short time, but it's hard to think of any similar span of time so packed with significance. I met the new American president, Mr. Truman, making his first big appearance on the world stage. I met Stalin. That was an experience. I remember as a boy visiting my uncle, the Tsar of Russia. In those days, to meet the autocrat, you had to pass through a line of Cossacks and some police. To meet Stalin, you had to pass through an outer line of sentries, then another line, then an inner line, and there were police and security men everywhere. Much more protection than my uncle ever had. Stalin was very polite. There was no hanging about waiting. Conversation flowed along very well, thanks to his brilliant interpreter, Pavlov, who could interpret as you talked if you made frequent short pauses. Stalin was very gay, full of optimism, as well he might be at that time. We were all wondering whether he was going to enter the war against Japan. So I told him about the plans I had agreed with General MacArthur and how we thought the Russians could fit in. I told him about what we had been doing in SEAC, which seemed to interest him. Immense decisions were taken at Potsdam, decisions which have affected the whole world ever since. Some of them affected me in the most immediate and drastic manner. It was at Potsdam, for instance, that I first learned that the boundaries of my command were going to be very greatly extended. This wasn't as flattering as it may sound. It was an inevitable reshuffle of responsibilities in the light of the heavy defeats which Japan had already suffered. Vastly more important were the decisions about the way in which Japan was to be finished off. The Allied leaders at Potsdam took it for granted that Japan, like Germany, must accept unconditional surrender. This was President Roosevelt's phrase, which he'd rather sprung on us at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Then, of course, it applied to the war in Europe. We weren't discussing Japan. The chiefs of staff had doubts about it as soon as we heard it. We feared that insisting on our enemies, throwing themselves entirely on our mercy, might harden their resistance and so prolong the war. But the policy was adopted, and unconditional surrender was enforced in Europe. Now, in July 1945, the same policy was also to be applied to Japan. Japan was a military empire. The traditions of the samurai, the warrior class, were built into the Japanese way of life. It was obviously important to knock these on the head. But there was another side to it. In the eyes of the overwhelming number of Japanese, the emperor was the son of heaven, in fact, a god. And gods don't accept unconditional surrender. So our demand struck not only at Japanese politics, but at their religion too. Inevitably, they rejected it. And inevitably, that meant that the Allies would have to use the utmost force against them. I now discovered the appalling implications of that. At Potsdam, I was told the most closely guarded secret of the war, the story of the development of the atomic bomb. The American chiefs of staff, Generals Marshall and Arnold, now informed me that a bomb was about to be dropped on Japan. Mr. Churchill and President Truman both confirmed this to me. There was no time for philosophical reflections. The dropping of the bomb was less than a fortnight off. So here we were, almost at the end of July, and I was being told to expect the Japanese to surrender in mid-August. Churchill told me to warn my staff in Siak, but I was forbidden to give any sort of explanation. I said they'd think I was mad if I just told them to prepare for an immediate Japanese surrender without any explanation at all.
I was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command. This amazing message shocked me. I just could not understand it. I thought that perhaps I didn't understand something about Admiral Mountbatten because heretofore he had always explained the orders that we received. I therefore went to General Browning, the Chief of Staff. When he read it, he was as shocked as I. We realized, however, that it required obedience. Here we were required to put our senior staff officers under operations to do something that we couldn't explain to them.
And so my SEAC staff had to rush forward all our plans for landing in Malaya and Singapore and just take my word for it that there'd be no opposition. It was a fantastic thought that this race of stubborn soldiers who scarcely knew the meaning of fear could be brought to their knees by one single dreadful weapon. Another great leader was now about to depart from the scene. At the Potsdam Conference, three men seemed to hold the world in the palms of their hands: Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. But on July the 25th, Winston Churchill flew off to London to hear the results of the 1945 general election. I don't think he had any premonition of what was coming. But to my great regret, I'd seen the last of him as my wartime chief. When the results came through, I was in London, and I took my staff down to Broadlands to work while we awaited instructions. I must say I was less surprised than some at what happened. I'd sensed from the mood of the troops in Siak that people wanted to change. Winston Churchill and the Conservatives were swept out of office, and the Labour Party, headed by Clem Attlee, came in with a landslide victory.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions, that it believes that Labour has the right policy and also has the men to carry it out.
It was sad to see Winston go. I had known him since boyhood, and I had enormously admired his stand against appeasement in the 30s. Then I had spent 2 exciting years working very closely with him when I was on the Chiefs of Staff's committee. He was never the easiest of men to work with. He nearly drove the Chiefs of Staff mad at times with his endless flow of ingenious schemes. But he kept us up to the mark all the time. His whole mind was concentrated on winning the war. That is why he was such a wonderful leader. That and his human touch. He knew how to inspire us, when to make us weep, when to make us laugh. I was extremely fond of him, and I know he was fond of me, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. I suspect he thought of me as being more of a swashbuckler than I really am. In war, he was splendid, but I was already worried about how we would get on in peace. Now, Winston had gone, and Mr. Attlee became Prime Minister. The first thing he had to do was to take over at a major inter-allied conference in midstream. I could see no possible difficulty in working with Mr. Attlee. I'd had some dealings with him when he was Deputy Prime Minister. I had respect and liking for him. I knew how businesslike he was, and of course, he had the advantage of full background knowledge of all the current situations. Already my job was becoming more political than military. When I reported to Mr. Attlee, I explained to him the line I proposed to take with the liberated territories when we'd driven the Japanese out of Southeast Asia, now an imminent prospect. I was delighted to find that I had his full backing. I had a feeling that I was going to need it.
Japan recoiled from unconditional surrender. She knew she was beaten, but could find no way of obtaining peace. The town of Hiroshima, the 7th largest in Japan, contained an arsenal, oil refineries, factories, a large garrison of soldiers. It was a military target. It also contained 343,000 people. At 7:09 on the morning of August the 6th, 1945, 4 American B-29s appeared in the cloudless sky above Hiroshima. The air raid siren sounded. 22 minutes later, the planes had gone. The all clear was heard. People emerged from their shelters and went about their lives. But there was a 5th plane in the sky that day. A Japanese journalist tells what followed. Suddenly, a glaring whitish, pinkish light appeared in the sky, accompanied by an unnatural tremor, which was followed almost immediately by a wave of suffocating heat and a wind which swept away everything in its path. Within a few seconds, the thousands of people in the streets in the center of the town were scorched by a wave of searing heat. Many were killed instantly. Others lay writhing on the ground, screaming in agony from the intolerable pain of their burns. Everything standing upright in the way of the blast, walls, houses, factories, was annihilated. Hiroshima had ceased to exist.
My reactions to the dropping of the bomb were somewhat mixed. It was all part of the war. It happened in a war context, which is very different from the context in which it has been talked about ever since. To begin with, I was appalled at the Japanese being given a chance to surrender before being completely defeated in the field. I was confident of our ability to clear them out of Southeast Asia because they were on the run everywhere. But now the visible demonstration of their defeat outside Japan would be missing. And it seemed to me that this was rather dangerous for the future. Face means a lot in Asia. I was afraid this would give them the chance to save face. On the other hand, one has to reckon this against the great saving of human life. Yes, saving of life that was made possible. I don't just mean Allied lives. Okinawa was very fresh in all our minds. 22 days to capture Okinawa. It cost about 50,000 American casualties, a quarter of whom were killed. But the Japanese army of over 100,000 was practically wiped out. They absolutely would not surrender. The soldiers would hold hand grenades to their stomachs and blow themselves up rather than give in. The generals committed ceremonial harikiri, disemboweled themselves. As the American official history says, there was only one kind of Japanese casualty, the dead. Those who were wounded either died of their wounds or returned to the front line to be killed. The Japanese soldier gave his all. Since they defended outlying islands like this, we had to ask ourselves what they were likely to do in their homeland. More Japanese died at Okinawa than at Hiroshima. How many Okinawas did we want? That was really how we thought about the bomb, as a means of ending this terrible war as quickly as possible. Even now, it took a second bomb, 3 days later, on Nagasaki to make Japan sue for peace. This was what civilization had come to. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were appalling lessons. I hope they will never be forgotten.
On August the 14th, Japan submitted in unconditional surrender. The emperor proclaimed to his people, "It is our desire to initiate an era of peace for future generations by tolerating the intolerable and enduring the unendurable." The surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay aboard the American battleship Missouri on Sunday, September the 2nd, 1945. General MacArthur was designated to accept the Japanese submission on behalf of the Allied powers.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
When the time came for him to sign the document, General MacArthur called forward Lieutenant General A. Percival, who'd signed the British surrender to the Japanese in Singapore in 1942, and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who'd surrendered the fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines in that same year. The presence of these two witnesses, liberated from their Japanese prison, was another symbolic gesture.
Well, the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay was very impressive. But for me, it was absolutely maddening. It delayed us getting here, to Singapore. General MacArthur had issued orders that no individual surrenders and no reoccupation of Japanese-held territory were to take place until after the big surrender at Tokyo. This meant a delay of ultimately 19 days, which was appalling. I already had a large fleet at sea, making for Malaya. There were lots of landing craft on the way, and we couldn't turn them back because they weren't designed to head into the southwest monsoon. Now I was afraid that some of them might even sink. The civil population of the whole territory had to remain under the Japanese for nearly 3 more weeks. But by far the worst thing was that tens of thousands of prisoners of war were waiting to be liberated. Some of them in such a weak state that they might die before we could reach them.
It was not until September the 5th that Mountbatten's forces reoccupied Singapore, and the city emerged from its long nightmare of occupation and oppression. Mountbatten's own arrival, with General Sir William Slim, Allied Land Forces commander, marked the beginning of a moment of triumph for both of them, which they savoured. In October 1943, in Delhi, Mountbatten had flown in to lift up the hearts of discouraged men with the promise of victory. Here in Singapore, they could taste the victory which he had promised them, and it would be a tasting in the Mountbatten style. If he and they felt cheated at all by the eternal deferments of what was to be their military masterpiece, if they were impatient at the long wait while General MacArthur played out his part in Tokyo, this occasion would wipe those thoughts away. This was going to be a moment of victory which everyone could recognize. It was going to be an occasion of panoply. Mountbatten saw to that.
Please be seated.
On September the 12th, in the Council Chamber of Singapore Town Hall, flanked by his senior officers and in the presence of military representatives of the United States, India, Australia, China, France and Holland, Mountbatten accepted the surrender of 680,879 Japanese in Southeast Asia.
I had rather different ideas from General MacArthur about how the Japanese should surrender. He thought the Japanese officers should not give up their samurai swords because it would mean such loss of face that they would no longer be able to control their men. I was determined that they should lose face, and I was prepared to take the risk of their losing control. So I insisted on senior commander swords being handed over here in Singapore and in all other appropriate places under my command. I don't think there was any doubt in the minds of those who witnessed the Japanese surrenders here in Singapore about whether the Japanese were beaten or not. These were amazing episodes to look back on, full of emotion for all of us.
I have today received the surrender of the Supreme Commander of the Japanese forces that you have been fighting, and I have accepted the surrender on behalf of all of you. I wish you all to know the gratitude and the pride that I feel towards every man and woman in this command today. You beat the Japanese soldier in battle, inflicting 6 times the number of deaths that he was able to inflict on you, and you chased him out of Burma. In 1942, the Japanese ordered that the Union Jack and a white flag should be carried through the streets of Singapore. In reply, a British officer explained that no Union Jack was available, as all had been burnt. The Japanese accepted this explanation. The officer concerned retained this Union Jack in Changi, where it was used for funerals. It has been handed back to me for hoisting ceremoniously on this historic occasion.
Only one actor was missing from this high drama. Mountbatten's opposite number, Field Marshal Terauchi, the Japanese Supreme Commander, was suffering from a stroke and could not make his surrender on September the 12th. Typically, Mountbatten sent an officer to verify that Terauchi was really ill, and typically, he did not forget Terauchi. In Singapore, General Slim took the sword of General Kimura, commander of the Japanese Burma Army. It stands on his mantelpiece, where he always intended it to be. In Saigon, a few months later, Mountbatten accepted from Marshal Terauchi not one ceremonial sword, but two. One he presented to the king. The other he took home with him to Broadlands.
So now the war was really over, and this sword belongs to me. I was immensely proud of the achievements of Southeast Asia Command. It wasn't simply the fact of our victory over the Japanese, it was what we had to contend with in order to obtain victory. The jungle, the monsoon, malaria, and perhaps above all, being so low down in the priority list that we never had enough of anything we needed. It's the memory of all that that binds our Burma Star Association together to this day. And looking back on it all now, one can see something else. Our campaign was the swan song of the British Empire in the Far East. It was not an unworthy one.
Victory. Victory in the desert. Victory in Italy. Victory in Northwest Europe. Victory in Burma. Victory in the skies. Victory at sea. Once again, in 1946, as in 1919, the moment was marked by a great parade of all the forces of the Commonwealth. Once again, the flags were carried through London streets with pride. It was not yet time to count the cost. It was time to cheer and give heartfelt thanks. This time, London itself had been in the line of battle. Few knew better than Londoners what this victory meant. This war against fascist aggressors had been a war for liberty, and this parade was a thanksgiving that British liberty had been once again preserved. Once again, a nation in arms paid glad tribute to its services.
Speaking for my own service, I would say that the Navy came out of World War II with great credit. In 1914, we were the greatest naval power in the world. And although there were some disappointing occasions, the Navy did keep complete command of the sea. In 1939, we enjoyed no such supremacy. But once more, we retained command of the sea virtually without allies for 2 years. And there were many brilliant exploits, and some very fine commanders came to the top. I can only mention a few. Sir Dudley Pound as First Sea Lord. Lord Cunningham, who became famous in the Mediterranean. Lord Fraser, who was my naval C&C in SEAC and then commanded the British Pacific Fleet. Sir Arthur John Parr, his very worthy successor in SEAC. Sir Philip Byrne, a tremendously dashing leader everywhere. There were many others. We'd had our bad moments, of course, and there were sad losses of ships and men. But on the whole, we'd done our homework well between the wars. Our ships were good, our officers really knew what they were about, and our men were better trained and as brave as ever. So now all the services could feel that they had won through. Everyone, and not least our long-suffering forces in SEAC, felt entitled to suppose that the fighting was over. But it wasn't. I now found myself faced with an entirely new, and in some ways, an even more bewildering dimension of supreme command. At the end of a war, as the saying goes, to the victor, the spoils. I'm afraid we didn't collect many spoils from the Japanese in Southeast Asia in 1945. Their legacy to us when they'd laid down their arms could be summed up in one word: chaos. Without any interval, no time for cheering, scarcely time to draw a breath, in fact. We had to take over and try to sort it all out. Work began immediately. Very hard work indeed, of a kind I'd never done before, dealing with a situation which had never existed before. A new force in world history.
Liberation came to Singapore and Malaya on September the 12th, 1945. It was already a fact in Burma. Liberation to Southeast Asia meant more than the defeat of Japan. It meant the unleashing of a surge of hope, the stimulation of dreams of nationhood, a new future. All these ideas entered the realm of possibility on the day the Japanese forces made their surrender in Singapore to the Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten.
For 3.5 years, we've had it very rough from the Japanese. They swaggered around in their high jack boots. They beat people up and generally lorded it over us. And here was the supreme moment when not only were we being delivered, more satisfying was the final humiliation of these little warriors who came down with their big swords and long bayonets, frightened everybody in Malaya and Singapore, being made quietly to climb up these flight of steps and really admit defeat. I think it was one of the great moments in history of Southeast Asia.
I now found myself in a totally new role. At the end of the surrender ceremony, here in the City Hall in Singapore, I ceased to be a fighting commander. The problems I now had to deal with were political and human problems, and on a terrifying scale. And it was impossible to disentangle them from each other. It was as urgent to bring these people food and medicine, or, for instance, to repair the drainage system, as it was to work out a system of administration which would meet the needs of the future.
I think you all realize, as well as we do, that for the time being, many of the shortcomings and hardships which still exist are inescapable. As a result of 6 years of world war, there is a world shortage of commodities and worldwide shortage of shipping. So if the material improvement in conditions here in Malaya is slow in coming about, this is entirely due to circumstances of a worldwide nature.
Everybody knew that it would never be the same again. In fact, the past was over and people were trying to feel their way to a new relationship. Some thought in terms of home rule, others more ambitious. But whatever it was, everybody knew, both the returning British officers and the local population, that things could never be the same. And probably Lord Mountbatten, by his manner and his style, exemplified the kind of liberal British tradition trying to meet a new human situation with a great sense of anticipation of the history of what is to come in this region. It might have gone the other way, a re-establishment of the old imperial Raj. But I think Lord Mountbatten, in his breezy naval way, as distinct from the old stuffy colonial governors with their plumed helmets, typified this break with the past. And yet, of course, he, with his royal connections and a member of the senior service of Britain, was also part of that same British ruling elite. And my view is, I think that made the transition easier, probably for the British and definitely for the local people.
I was just 45 years old when I took on this great responsibility. Now, from Government House, Singapore, I found myself ruling over an enormous area. Before the Potsdam Conference, I'd been responsible for Burma, Malaya, and Singapore, Siam, and Sumatra. Now, I was also responsible for all the rest of the Dutch East Indies, but French Indochina only up to the 16th parallel. Later, I had to add Borneo and Dutch New Guinea as well, but fortunately, not for long. The original SEAC area was 1 million square miles. Now, it was 1.5 million. It contained 128 million people. There were nearly 750,000 Japanese still at large in it. There were 123,000 Allied prisoners of war and internees. The whole of this vast area was in a state of utter administrative chaos, and much of it was facing imminent starvation. The reports that poured into me daily here in Government House, Singapore, were more and more depressing.
The presence of the Japanese was one of the most depressing factors throughout Mountbatten's command area. With the world shipping shortage of 1945, nothing like enough was available to carry these defeated armies back to Japan. And so they remained in Southeast Asia, unwanted guests. Uses were found for them. They were put to work, repairing damage, clearing away the distasteful reminders of the time of occupation, when they had been the masters. This was an agreeable sight to those who had endured their rule. But there were other uses of the Japanese that were less agreeable. In fact, grimly ironic. Everywhere the Japanese had destroyed the colonial administrations, British, French, and Dutch. They had also bitterly antagonized the local populations, who formed resistance groups and guerrilla forces. These now expected to take power. Lawless elements, bandits and dacoits, also perceived their opportunities for loot. Until the British could arrive, and this was no easy matter, the only means of preserving any sort of law and order was the disagreeable one of using the Japanese themselves. This was not good for the Allied image.
I knew quite well that the spectacle of Japanese troops and our own apparently cooperating was likely to sap confidence in our intentions, and I didn't like it at all. But there was another reason why I disliked having to do this. It's hard to express how we who'd fought the Japanese came to loathe them. British troops are not good haters, and I'm quite sure they never felt like this about the Italians or even the Germans, though I dare say the Poles and Russians did. We came to associate the Japanese with sheer inhumanity towards the wounded, towards prisoners, and towards helpless civilians. There were far too many well-authenticated cases of brutality and murder. The Japanese had a habit of bayoneting their captives, and somehow this seemed to make the atrocity worse. And when we discovered, in such places as this, Singapore's notorious Changi Jail, or the torture rooms of Outram Road Prison, what they had done to the prisoners they didn't kill, we were even more horrified and revolted. On the very day they accepted unconditional surrender, the Japanese massacred 152 civilians here in Singapore. It was cruelties such as these that caused a number of their leaders to be branded as war criminals.
The rescue of prisoners of war and civilian internees from the Japanese prisons and prison camps was the most urgent task of the liberating forces. There were nearly 250 of these camps. The first need was to locate them. The second, to rush in medical supplies and food. The third, to get the men out. Thousands had already died of starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. By the Japanese military code, a soldier who surrendered had lost his honor, and his life was therefore worthless. The Japanese were not concerned with keeping these men alive. Conditions in the prison camps were always bad, in certain areas terrible. From Sumatra, Lady Mountbatten reported to the Red Cross in St. John, "There is no doubt that had the war gone on a few more weeks, there would have been no prisoners of war in these areas left alive at all. They were absolutely at their last gasp."
Edwina was Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade and chairman of its joint war organization with the Red Cross. She'd already had a large hand in the recovery of Allied prisoners of war from Germany, so it would be fair to call her an expert on the problem. When I was in London after the Potsdam Conference, I asked her to come out and deal with it in our part of the world. I really don't know what we'd have done in Southeast Asia without her. I gave her a letter stating who she was and that she was in charge of the advanced arrangements for the recovery of prisoners of war and internees. Armed only with this, she went off everywhere with just a small personal staff, met the Japanese commanders who kowtowed and did whatever she told them.
Accompanying Lady Mountbatten on many of these dangerous missions was her private secretary, Mrs. Elizabeth Collins.
I joined her in Kandy in 1945, then off to Sumatra, where there was much sickness and where the prisoners had to be evacuated as quickly as possible, and where Lady Mountbatten directed the major part of the work from the camps. She had to give her orders to the heavily armed Japanese officers, who soon realized that here was somebody with the most amazing drive and ability, and if she said a thing had to be done, then it had to be. They had thousands of troops covering the areas because she was the first person who arrived in these camps. She worked 16 hours a day non-stop and then started her paperwork in the middle of the night. As for the prisoners themselves, she had that terrific magical quality which I can't describe, but they also realized that here was a most sincere person and a very practical one, who would get on with the job and who had brought help to them after those 3.5 years of captivity.
Together, whenever that was possible, the Mountbattens would visit the camps where men waited for repatriation, their deepest desire. The compassion of Lord and Lady Louis was visible. Their sympathy was utterly practical. Their impact was unforgettable.
It was hard to think what to say to these men. Sometimes, seeing the condition they were in, I could hardly say anything at all. They certainly didn't want to be bothered with formal inspections and a lot of rhetoric. So quite often I'd just gather them round me and tell them what had been happening and what was going on. After all, they'd been cut off from all civilization for years, and they needed to be put back in touch with things as much as they needed medicine and food. Anyway, they seemed to appreciate this. I hope they did.
When you first met her, whether you were a general or a private, she had an immediate and lasting impact from the warmness of her personality. She had not only the ability and the organizing power and the energy of an absolutely outstanding man, but she combined with it the sympathy, the understanding, and the compassion of a woman. There was nothing of stage management, nothing of an act. It was just someone speaking in spite of exhaustion, hardship, and danger, and Lady Louis suffered many of these, someone speaking directly from their own heart. She never left the ward of a hospital or a prison camp without leaving every man in it feeling a surge again of his will to survival.
I am sure that Edwina saved countless lives by her tireless personal activity. And although I'm speaking about my own wife, I must add that I consider it was a heroic effort.
Each day, Mountbatten discovered more of his grim legacy from the Japanese. In 1942, when Japan completed her vast conquests in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, she called these conquered lands the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was the beginning, she proclaimed, of a new order in Asia. In fact, co-prosperity had meant something very different. The march of Japan had meant destruction. Destruction of natural resources, destruction of productive capacity, destruction of communications, and with them trade and people's livings, destruction of shrines and monuments, death and wounds for the civilian populations. Japan's conquests were lands in ruin. Co-prosperity meant poverty, sickness, subjection, and fear. The new order had not brought independence, but had greatly increased the desire for it. When Japan collapsed, Asian nationalism surged into new life. But for the time being, this could only mean added disorder.
It's very difficult to convey the impact of all this at the time. The main point is that these conditions amounted to a complete breakdown, and they existed to a greater or lesser extent in every one of the territories for which I was responsible. And they all had to be tackled immediately and simultaneously. I can make a list of the problems and talk about them one by one, but we couldn't deal with them one by one. Everything was happening at once. And the other important thing was that the force at my disposal, upon which our whole position in Southeast Asia ultimately rested, was steadily getting weaker. British units were being systematically demobilized. They asked for nothing better than to get home. Indian forces, by far the largest component in SEAC, couldn't be used indefinitely to implement British policy, of which Indian opinion often disapproved, so the time factor was all important. We had to do many things all at once and very fast.
Singapore itself, seat of Mountbatten SEAC headquarters, was in a restless mood in 1945, its population divided and disturbed.
Coming back here to Singapore to make this television series in 1967, not very long after another grave emergency in this region, I can see a lot of changes. In particular, of course, this island of Singapore is now independent of the mainland of Malaya. In 1945, both came under my military administration, and our problems here then were political and racial. There were 5 million people in this area at that time, 43% of them Chinese, 41% Malays, and a large number of Indians. The Japanese have been playing one community off against another, and the Chinese have been the chief sufferers. The Chinese, with their strong commercial instincts, were the wealthiest community. They were also the most politically conscious and the best organized. It was they who had taken the lead in the resistance to the Japanese. But the most effective section of the Chinese resistance had undoubtedly been the Communist Party, which regarded the expulsion of the Japanese as only a stage towards the expulsion of the British. So we could expect trouble, and we got it. Here in Singapore, the showdown came in January and February 1946. The communists tried to subvert the administration by strikes and mass demonstrations. They failed. The administration stood firm, which I think surprised them. But it was a very unpleasant situation, and I had to take some difficult decisions. My policy here was on the same lines as it had been in Burma. I had to restore order, but I was against anything that looked like repression by the British. I was determined to err, if I erred, on the side of leniency. I was criticized for this. I probably still am. Some people, including some of my senior officers, thought I was being too lenient. Well, the subsequent history of the area has not been an entirely happy one. All I can say is that while I was responsible, what I was trying to do was to promote goodwill and not ill will, and I do the same thing again.
Bangkok, 1967. The capital of Thailand, once better known as Siam. Commercialized, modernized, westernized, but preserving, like crystallized dreams, the monuments of a legendary past. The monarchy itself is such a relic, dating from the 18th century, but still a powerful force in a country which clings to tradition, while the modern ideologies of East and West fight bitterly across the borders. The Siamese monarchy owes something to Mountbatten. In 1945, Siam was technically an enemy. Her territory had been necessary to the Japanese as a strategic springboard. Her rice crop had been necessary to uphold the myth of co-prosperity. In 1941, Japanese forces landed. Siamese resistance was slight, and soon the country was under Japanese domination. In 1942, the Japanese forced Siam to declare war on Britain and America. When this technical state of war ended in January 1946, Mountbatten went to Bangkok to attend the peace celebrations. The young king of Siam, brother of the present ruler, reviewed the great parade. Mountbatten had pressed for the retention of the monarchy, believing that this institution was the best means of preserving stability. His friendship with the Siamese royal house dates from this occasion.
In 1945-46, the Siamese fell over themselves to be friendly and hospitable to our troops, and to wipe out the unfortunate memory of having been technically at war with us. But unfortunately, all was not plain sailing in our relations with the Siamese government at that time. Under Japanese occupation, food production all over Southeast Asia had declined, above all rice, which was the staple food. Starvation was an imminent threat, and there is no sharper spur to revolution than starvation. Siam was the largest rice producer in Southeast Asia. We needed Siam's rice supplies very badly, but it took quite a while to get an adequate flow going again into the starving areas outside Siam.
In all the countries of Mountbatten's vast domain, angry nationalism, spurred by hunger, became a formidable force to reckon with. Each day, each week, threw up new problems.
The French and Dutch territories were our worst headache by far. They presented a double problem. First, we were pledged to hand back their overseas possessions to our French and Dutch allies, without really knowing what their policies for these areas were going to be, or how these areas were going to receive them. There was always the disagreeable possibility that SEAC forces might be involved in backing up attitudes and policies which were contrary to the Atlantic Charter. And secondly, neither the French nor the Dutch had the resources available to take over themselves immediately. So there was a power vacuum in which communism, nationalist extremism, and sheer brigandage flourished.
In French Indochina, containing the states now known as Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the power vacuum produced a situation of complex danger. In 1945, the Japanese had overthrown the last vestiges of Vichy French authority. Now there was a contest for power. The French tried to reassert themselves, but their forces were very weak. The nationalist leader was Ho Chi Minh, who had set up the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, in exile in China in 1941. Now Ho Chi Minh had returned to end French rule. Ho Chi Minh was known to be a communist, but he received American backing as an anti-colonialist. The British felt obliged to support their French allies and at least keep order until French policy clarified. A further complication was China, under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who also had a stake in Vietnam.
I went there as a correspondent in September 1945, and in Saigon, the capital, I saw the beginnings of all the trouble that went on for so many, many years afterwards. First the French War, then much later the American War, none of which need have happened if Mountbatten's advice had been taken at the time. The original error was made at Potsdam when they decided to carve French Indochina in half horizontally at the 16th parallel and give the northern part to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who was then thought to represent China. This was utterly stupid. Vietnam, as Mountbatten knew, ought to have been, and ought always to be, one territory. The Vietnamese never particularly liked the Chinese. Ho Chi Minh, with whom, no doubt, Mountbatten would have negotiated in accordance with his principle of negotiating with the genuine nationalist resistance leaders, he might have been the Tito of Southeast Asia. He would much rather have been independent of Peking, whether it was under Chiang or even under the communists. And I'm quite sure that if only the French government at home had not been so intransigent, so obstinate and slow to move out, all the trouble could have been averted. It must have been heartbreaking for Mountbatten to be in command militarily, in a sense, and yet to have to leave the essential political decisions to other nations.
It was heartbreaking, because one could see tragedy building up all the time. Yet I couldn't leave French Indochina to anarchy, which is what seemed to be the most likely thing in 1945. I sent in our troops under General Gracie, who took a firm grip on the situation straight away and tried to calm things down. This cost us quite a few casualties, I'm afraid. But after a time, free French troops arrived with up-to-date equipment and commanded by their famous general, Leclerc. Bit by bit, they took over from us, for which I was thankful. Vietnam was now their problem. Even so, the division of the country along the 16th parallel, decreed at Potsdam, was already revealed as a disaster for which the whole world was to suffer for so many years. So the wars in Vietnam really owed their origin to this mistake in 1945. We couldn't see that far into the future at the time. To us, the Dutch East Indies seemed to be a much worse problem.
To the Dutch East Indies, Japan had brought promises of independence, and a little more. The Dutch had begun their rule over this empire of 3,000 islands in the 16th century. Their form of colonialism had been oppressive. Dr. Ahmed Sukarno, the nationalist leader, was interned and released from Dutch imprisonment by the Japanese. Under his leadership, Japan set up an Indonesian Central Advisory Council to prepare for independence. The Japanese gave the Indonesians arms and trained them as soldiers. 1 week before they surrendered, they warned Sukarno and advised him that now was his time. On August the 17th, 1945, 2 days after Japan's surrender, he proclaimed a Republic of Indonesia. By the time Mountbatten's forces and the representatives of the Dutch government arrived in Java, the new republic had had a month to organize and prepare, if necessary, to fight. Mountbatten's troops had two objects: to remove the Japanese and to evacuate the many thousands of Allied prisoners of war and the internees, mostly Dutch. At once they found their task complicated by the bitter conflict which developed between the Indonesians and the returning Dutch. The Indonesians began to use the internees as hostages. Conditions in some camps in the interior were bad, but now a new danger arose: massacre, either in the camp or in the course of evacuation. And even when these people reached the safety of British protection, their troubles were not over. For most of them, this meant leaving the East Indies, the end of a way of life, loss of possessions, parting with the country they knew, to return to a homeland where they would be strangers. The conflict between colonialism and nationalism became intense. For Mountbatten, the chief consideration was to prevent British and Indian troops being involved on one side or the other. But this was not always possible.
Indonesia caused us more worry and unhappiness than any other area. At bottom, our troubles were due to lack of information. Neither General MacArthur's intelligence staff nor my own Dutch staff gave me any idea of the strength of the nationalist movement. I suppose they didn't know themselves. Edwina was really the first person to give me an inkling of what was going on. Everything that I had done my best to avoid in the British territories, Malaya and Burma, seemed to happen in Indonesia. Every attitude seemed to be displayed in its worst aspect. There were horrible mutilations and massacres, and ugly deeds on both sides. Neither the British nor the Indian troops liked the difficult and dangerous job they were called on to do, and neither did I. We had over 2,000 British and Indian casualties in Indonesia in one of the most thankless tasks our troops have ever had to carry out. It was really sickening.
Not until July 1946 was the British task in Indonesia completed. British strength in Southeast Asia was now steadily running down as the British and Indian forces returned to their homes and the demobilization they had earned so well. Civil administrations were taking over throughout the SEAC area.
The Special Commissioner for Southeast Asia, appointed at my request, Lord Killerne, arrived in Singapore in March. He immediately became very much involved in the food problem, which was still acute, because there was a world food shortage at that time. In that month, we had another important arrival, Pandit Nehru, the most distinguished figure in the Indian interim government, came to Singapore to study the conditions of the large Indian community and meet the Indian forces there. It would be hard to think of a more fateful meeting. It could easily have gone terribly wrong. Nehru had just been in prison for opposing our war effort. One of the things he was supposed to do was to lay a wreath on the memorial to the Indian National Army, who'd fought against us. In fact, his whole visit could have developed into a vast anti-British demonstration. Not very nice to think about when you consider that the bulk of our forces here were Indians. Yet, if the original plans made by the local authorities in my absence had been followed, I felt that this is exactly what could have happened. The local authorities wanted to cold shoulder Nehru, to hamper his movements, to restrict his contact with the Indian community. I thought that this would be disastrous. This man was clearly going to be Prime Minister of India. How fatal for future Anglo-Indian relations to treat him like that. The local authorities hadn't even arranged to let Nehru have a car, so I lent him mine. We brought hundreds of Indians into Singapore in army trucks to see him. I received him immediately at Government House and then drove with him through the streets where he had a fantastic welcome. At the Indian Red Cross Recreation Center, Edwina was waiting to meet him. The enthusiasm inside was so overwhelming that Edwina was knocked over in the rush, and Nehru and I had to rescue her together. That night, I invited him to dinner with us. It was a very happy little party. I was able to persuade him not to lay the wreath on the pro-Japanese Indian National Army Memorial, and in fact, his whole 9-day visit passed off very well, without any unpleasantness of any description or any disturbance. This really was a stroke of fate. It was the beginning of a deep friendship between Jawaharlal Nehru and Edwina and myself. How important this was going to be, of course, I couldn't possibly guess. But the value of establishing this link was obvious enough. It was not only valuable as a matter of British policy, it was valuable to Nehru too. It helped to prevent him adopting extreme attitudes, which couldn't have failed to make things difficult for him later as Prime Minister. It helped to wipe out the bitterness of the past. But what I value above all is the lasting friendship we formed.
The Mountbatten talent for friendship soon found other outlets. A few days after meeting Nehru, Lord and Lady Mountbatten visited Australia and New Zealand at the invitation of the governments of those countries. The purpose of the visit was very similar to that of an earlier occasion, the Prince of Wales's tour in 1920, a goodwill tour, when Mountbatten witnessed the enthusiastic welcome of the Prince. Now he was the recipient of such a welcome, he and Lady Louis. For as one Australian newspaper proclaimed in banner headlines, he's a beaut and she's even more of a beaut. Australians would be slow to forget the work that Lady Louis had done for their prisoners of war in the Japanese camps. The visit in both countries was a triumph.
Although I originally came over for the purposes of discussions with the Australian Cabinet and the Chiefs of Staff, the wonderful welcome that my wife and I have had from all the people of Australia has been a very great thrill indeed, and something that we shall both remember as long as we live.
I, like my husband, have been deeply touched at the really lovely welcome that we've received since we arrived in Australia. And I did welcome the kind invitation of the Commonwealth Government to accompany him on this tour. Particularly so because it's already given me the opportunity of seeing a large number of the prisoners of war whom I met in the Japanese camps during last year, and also doctors and nurses and Red Cross workers who were my colleagues in those bad months in the Far East.
But Mountbatten was still Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. He had business to do with the Australian leaders, and his method of doing it impressed them. There were even rumors that he might become Governor-General, keeping that post in the family by succeeding his cousin, the Duke of Gloucester. But this was not to be.
General salute! Present! Out!
His period of command was drawing to an end. In May 1946, the Right Honourable Malcolm MacDonald, at Mountbatten's request, arrived as Governor-General of Malaya and Singapore, and Mountbatten proudly handed over to him a fully functioning administration.
When I arrived in Malaya, I found that my duties had been greatly eased by the policy which Lord Mountbatten had been pursuing just before. An immense political change had taken place throughout Asia. The local people's acceptance of colonial rule by Western imperial powers was no longer effective, and they had a passionate desire to attain national independence for themselves. That movement was, of course, opposed by most of the British and other European people living in those parts at that time. The governors, the provincial commissioners, the generals and the colonels had a sense of what was then called the white man's burden. They thought that we had a destiny to rule Asia in the interests of the Asians themselves. Lord Mountbatten had completely opposed that attitude. He treated with deep sincerity all the Asians as absolute equals with ourselves. and he sympathized with their desire for national independence. He encouraged their nationalist movements. Now, the fact that he was the supreme military commander and a man of very great social eminence holding those views, of course, made an impression. And the circumstance that he was a relation of royalty aided the influence which he exerted. And a lot of the Europeans, who were snobs, thought, if that is what Lord Mountbatten thinks, perhaps there's something in it. And the fact is, to sum up, that Mountbatten played a very great part in starting the process of transition from colonialism to independence throughout Asia by peaceful processes. And the fact that the process in the British territories continued in a peaceful, constitutional, and friendly way throughout the continent is owing in distinct measure to Louis Mountbatten's leadership.
For Mountbatten, in the second half of 1946, the time came when the returning warrior receives his due reward. For one who had done so much, the rewards were many. In London's historic Guildhall, he was presented with the Sword of Honour and the Freedom of the City.
The freedom of the City of London is by common consent the greatest civic honor in the British Empire. I am deeply appreciative of its bestowal on me today, and the Sword of Honor, which will be my most treasured possession, shall hang above that sword which was surrendered to me by the Japanese Supreme Commander of the Southern Regions, Field Marshal Count Terauchi.
From the Guildhall, the Mountbattens drove in triumph to the Mansion House, where the Supreme Commander had another speech to make.
If there are any of my own friends from Southeast Asia down there in the crowd among you, I'd like you to know you ought to be up here on the balcony with me.
London's honours were followed by other valued freedoms, by honorary degrees, presidencies of distinguished organizations. Allied countries also added their accolade. At the Invalides in Paris, with full panoply, Mountbatten was invested with the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor by France's famous fighting soldier, Marshal Juin. The Mountbattens celebrated an event of different gratification, the marriage of their eldest daughter. The Honourable Patricia Mountbatten was 22 years old. Now she married her father's ADC, Sir John Knatchbull, Bombay and Bengal, and temporary Viceroy of India for 6 months in 1938. Once more, a Mountbatten wedding brightened the social scene. Mountbatten himself now had a new title, commemorating the great campaign conducted under him, Mountbatten of Burma. It commemorated also his first passage to the orders of high politics.
Lord Mountbatten in Southeast Asia had two roles, of course, the military and the semi-political for a short time. His military campaign was supremely successful. As far as the political situation was concerned, he was faced with some pretty tricky decisions. Burma presented a particular problem, and it was here, I think, that Lord Mountbatten earned some criticism, particularly from the Conservative Party. He selected a nationalist, what is more, one part of the guerrilla war conducted by Japanese and part of their irregular Burmese army in Burma. He let it be known that if a man had been a traitor, it wouldn't count against him politically. And so he selected Aung San to conduct the independence negotiations with the British government. Some of the critics will say that he failed because Burma left the Commonwealth. I would be inclined to think that he was supported in his Southeast Asia policies by the great majority of people in this country, although the Burmese one was undoubtedly one which did lead to criticism.
We in Burma are very pleased that Lord Louis Mountbatten is given the title of Mountbatten of Burma because of his successful campaign in our country. And we are doubly pleased because we found in him a man that understood our national aspirations. Quite frankly speaking, we were not very sure that we will get our independence so quickly after the return of the British. But when we come into contact with Mountbatten of Burma, we are confident and we are convinced that we will get what we wanted. Because in him, we found a man with great foresight. And I'm glad that working with him, we, the Burmese in Burma, and the British parted as friends.
Mountbatten never pretended that he did not relish honours. Now a secret ambition was fulfilled. The king conferred upon him the most coveted award of all. With ancient ceremony, Mountbatten became a Knight of the Order of the Garter, his banner hanging in illustrious company in St. George's Chapel, Windsor.
It was wonderful to be home again. It was wonderful to be honored in all these ways. I've always got an enormous kick out of such things. I know every commander says that his honors are as much a tribute to his men as to himself. But in my case, that was true in a special way. My men had had to go on fighting when their comrades in Europe had stopped, and then carry on even further into what should have been peace. To carry on like that after a war, risking their lives all over again, a long way from home, for obscure causes, was a much harder thing than even fighting the war itself. I'm not very good at philosophizing. It's not a thing I normally do. Yet, obviously, the policies I believed in must have sprung from a philosophy of life. I was quite sure in 1945 that it was no good fighting against the new tide of Asian nationalism. That the thing to do was to try to make the nationalists our friends. This was easier for me than for some because I liked many of them personally and their countries. Nevertheless, much as I'd come to love the East, it was with a sense of relief that I handed over this responsibility and came home. I was just on 46 years old. I was still in the Royal Navy. I'd just been promoted from substantive captain to rear admiral, and I very badly wanted to get back to sea.